Hello and welcome back to Mandibil. Now I am heading into part 3 of my presentation of my complete philosophy, or at least as complete as it needs to be for me to get to my goal, which is a definition of a moral principle. Okay, so far I have dealt with ontology and external world, and I've ended up in a situation where I have decided to work from the axiom that there is an external world, without going any further into any kind of metaphysics or description of it, and even saying that because I decided that there is an external world, there must be an external world that doesn't follow either. The only thing I have decided to do is work from the idea that there's some aspect that is external to my phenomena, without clarifying it any further, because I cannot refute it. And that's the problem. It's because I cannot settle that it isn't there, that there isn't something, quote, there. Therefore, I have to, according to the philosophy I've presented so far, I have to deal with it as if it is there, according to the prior philosophy. So please go back and take a look at the first 2 parts in order to understand how I get to this point. Okay, so the next step will be to get into what I call epistemology, which is the philosophy necessary, quote, to arrive at a definition of knowledge. And you could say, well, why do I need knowledge? Good point. I try to take it the other way around. I do some philosophy, and I get to some point where I need to say, I have this thing here. I need to do something about this thing here. I need to classify it or describe it or anything, something like that. And I do that by creating an axiom, or a definition, or a lemma, or whatever I might choose to call it. But because there's some particular aspect I need to deal with now, because I established that external world, or I didn't establish it, I chose to work from the idea. Be careful with my choice of words, right? Then there must be some connection between what I've already got and that which I chose to deal with, because I chose to deal with it in a way where it seems like it has some effect on how that thing I'm dealing with in my ontology, my phenomena. I'm not, without going into changing anything of my ontology, because I can't do that, and I described that in my prior. So to avoid any circularity in this kind of reasoning, I am going to, rather than saying, I'm going to describe how it affects my ontology, which I can't do. I can only say that what I have to work with is somehow influenced by my interpretation, or how I choose to address my phenomena is decided upon by the notion that they might be representation of something outside. That's the closest I think I can get to it without creating a circular argument. How I choose to address my phenomena has no bearing on why they're there. That's what I'm trying to get to. I'm still sitting on this side of a potential border between my phenomena and what might be beyond my phenomena. I'm still sitting on the inside, deciding, okay, when I have that experience, I'm going to understand it this way, right? You might argue, possibly, that I'm creating a circle here. Maybe you could argue that. But then, the only alternative, in my opinion, is to be a solipsist. And I simply can't do that. Because a solipsist will just sit there and say, why does these things appear in this particular way, A, B, and C, that I have observed? You will have to say, I don't know. So I'm forced to do something about it, in my opinion. And I can't live a functional life, in my opinion, without doing this. So if you think there's circularity in what I'm doing when I'm doing epistemology, you will have to reject what I'm saying and do it some other way. And if you have another way of doing it, please enlighten me. Show me how you do it. I would like to understand it, right? But this is how I choose to do it. And I don't think it's circular, right? Because I stay on the inside of my phenomena, so to say. I'm not jumping out and say, because the external world behaves or does things this or that way, that's why the phenomena does this. I'm saying, when I have this phenomena, I can't tell you why it's there, but when I experience that, I'm going to treat it this way. That's another approach, in my opinion. It might seem like it's somewhat fluffy, and maybe it's a limitation of my ability to describe it. So, but at least this is where I'm going. Okay. So let me take the next slide. Let me read out loud here. An inevitable result of my latest risk assessment, which is how I decided, or what I did to figure out whether or not I'm going with the idea of an external world or not. That was the prior risk assessment. That's what I'm referring to. The inevitable result of that is that I have to accept an axiom, or the axiom is that an external world is somehow inflicting itself on my phenomena. Because that was built into my risk assessment. I couldn't do the risk assessment without appealing to the notion that that external world somehow inflicts on my phenomena. If it doesn't, I can't do the risk assessment, because there's no risk then. I mean, right? It would become, I would be dishonest in making a risk assessment where I base a risk on an external world that inflicts itself on my phenomena, then without addressing that that's what I'm actually doing. So in my opinion, I have to bring in an axiom to even out this potential undisclosed philosophy. And the axiom, which is axiom 2, an external world influences my phenomena. And I flesh it out a bit more by saying an external world at least influences how at least some of my phenomena appear and or behave. Maybe this is not the most perfect, but I want to, an external world influences my phenomena. That seems a little too broad. So I'm not saying that an external world influences all of my phenomena. And influences is, I try to make it as weak as I can without saying there's a direct connection or whatever. Influences is just the weakest, broadest term I can use in order to say there's some kind of thing going on. I can't get to it, but there's something going on, right? I know there's something going on. That's an old Frida from ABBA song with Phil Collins on drums, right? Okay. I know there's something going on. But I don't think it's epistemology they're doing, right? Okay. How at least some of my phenomena appear and or behave. So, an external world might somehow influence if they're there and what they do, right? And I say that this generalized but still weak way in order to not say more than I need to say, right? So, as my diagram here shows, there's something going on beyond my phenomena, and it has some kind of, influence, but, no more than that. I desperately want to avoid metaphysics and a circular reasoning here, right? I stay, this external world thing and its doings, its whereabouts, right, is purely imaginative. It's an abstraction. That external world is not there. It's down there in category C. But I pretend that it addresses it somehow, right? Because all of this philosopher is an abstraction of mine. So that external world is sitting there together with all the other abstractions I'm doing. That is my philosophy. But this is a representation of that abstraction. You understand? So this is sort of meta level. Okay, enough of that. Since qualia is my reduction base and cognition always follows from them, they seem to be connected to an outside world as a pair, right? So because I've established sort of that connection, I'm aligning them in a connected order. I'm not telling you about that external world. I'm just putting it next to my phenomena, right? I'm not addressing what it's made of and where it is and what it does. I'm just placing it close to the first thing I have access to, which is my reduction base, the qualia, CSSTT, right? Color, sound, smell, touch, and taste. And whenever I have qualia, it seems I always get some kind of some cognition, right? And then we have the abstractions, which I've dealt with before. They sort of distance a bit there, right? So I've created this sort of structure now, right? External world somehow influences qualia that creates cognitions. Or cognitions are created based on qualia, maybe you could say. I don't want to flesh it out too much, but I risk going into saying something I can't, right? But it is sort of, I'm aligning my philosophy here in a structure. Okay? Since qualia is my reduction base and cognition always follow from them, they seem to be connected to an outside world as a pair. And that's the pair I have there. I shove the external world up next to my phenomena and then connect them to the qualia, so to say. And because qualia is directly connected with cognitions, I bring them to the borderline there, so to say, right? It's just a visualization of my kind of thinking. Okay, so qualia is also sort of out of my control. So it makes perfect sense to make them the closest to an external world and cognitions as being dependent on them, right? So I have no idea why red is red and why it appears. It's simply beyond explanation, in my opinion. And that is also another indicator that the closer you get to the borderlines in this structure, the less you can say about it, right? I can only basically say, well, there are colors, and sometimes there are sounds, and sometimes there are tastes and touch and smell, right? I can't explain it. I can't explain red. I can't explain color. It's just there, kind of, right? So it would be even more ridiculous to say, I can go and tell you about how an external world, both that it is there and how it works and what it's made of, based on something that is completely inexplicable. So going one step behind qualia is completely ridiculous, right? It's completely ridiculous. And you have to be very, very, very careful and be absolutely on top of every word and every term and how it's argued about the potential external world. In my opinion, if the philosopher who presents it, or whatever you would call that person, doesn't stay on the sort of light green side of things, according to my standard here, they're basically fabulating about something they have no business doing, right? Qualia is sort of out of my control, so it makes perfect sense to make them the closest to an external world. Yeah, because if I have this structure and dependence, and I've made an external world, and in order to make a risk assessment about it, that potential external world, I have to sort of pretend that it's doing something to my phenomena. It sort of just falls into this place that I have to do this according to my own philosophy now. I can't philosophize further without doing this, because that's what I was doing. If I don't do this, I'm dishonest about what I just presented. So I have to do this. I'm putting restrictions on my own philosophy now, in a way, right? So you can't just sit there and throw words out up in the air and just pretend that you have to make sure that you're not deluding yourself, and you have a bias. You need to go in that direction and bringing along your dogmas and all that. I try to avoid that at all cost here, right? Abstractions are then of secondary nature compared to abstractions, which are category C, are of secondary nature, and I mentioned that in the prior part, right? Secondary nature compared to the other, A and B, because they are dependent on A and or B. Category C is dependent on A or A and B, right? At least A. If there's no A, there's no abstraction. There's no memory of abstractions, there's no imaginations, anything. If there weren't in, that's basically a built-in axiom, maybe you could also say. But it goes sort of without saying, or at least it should, in my opinion, right? Okay. So, since qualia always comes first and cognitions follow, qualia is the deepest level of insight, you can say, into an external world. But since there are cognitions, category B, and they don't have an obvious necessity, it makes sense for me to think of cognitions as a more precise representation of what is going on in an external world, rather than only pure qualia. If you have qualia and they are the closest thing, according to this standard, to an external world that I have, then why is it not enough? Well, apparently it isn't. Cognitions also appear, right? And since it does that, I have to take that seriously, in my opinion. And since it does it, it must somehow be more important than the qualia, at least in some regard. And one way to think of it maybe is that cognitions are more, as I said, more precise representation of what is going on in an external world, rather than only pure qualia. And the reason is that lots of different cognitions can have the same color. But an elephant, for instance, is always an elephant, right? An elephant is not something else. It's particular. So there's some precision about cognitions that is not there potentially in qualia. And I say that it's not there because they are cognitions. There's something that is lacking as unprecise about qualia that cognition helps establish. And because there is this function, this is where I bring in my knowledge, or my definition of knowledge. And my knowledge I highlight as pink because that was the pink box in the scope of my philosophy, the first slide you have seen a lot of times now, right? That becomes pink now because that's what I classify as knowledge. Okay, so since cognitions then are considered the most precise representation, now, according to what I just said, right, of what is going on, and qua axiom 2, an external world influences my phenomena, then I will think of cognitions as knowledge. It also makes sense to choose cognitions as knowledge, because what could an idea of knowledge be other than a reference to the deepest possible insight into an external world? And as I said before, and cognitions are either the case or not the case. So I avoid, some fundamental fluffiness about the definition of knowledge, which seems to generally be the problem in all definitions of knowledge. Yeah, but you can also know this. Yeah, but then I can also know this. And basically, all they say that all my phenomena are knowledge. I mean, that's stupid. Then you're saying phenomena, and now I'm going to use a new word called knowledge to say the same thing as phenomena. So it's just redundant, right? It's just upgrading it to a better term without clarifying what is the upgrade. So this is extremely clear what I mean by knowledge, and I reason and I argue and reason for why it makes sense to classify this as knowledge. Okay, but still, I am not saying that these cognitions are outside of my phenomena. I am staying put in my ontology, so to say. I'm staying with my phenomena. I'm just sitting from the inside and looking at my phenomena and classifying them in a particular way because of my philosophy. I'm just treating a particular category of my phenomena, in this case cognitions, in a particular way. I am addressing them in a particular way as a kind of representation of an external world. You see what I do? I am looking at my phenomena rather than staring myself blind on an external world. I say there's a connection between an external world and my phenomena, but I'm not stepping outside my phenomena in order to fabulate about this mystical external world that I haven't even established, right? I'm just taking it into account because of my risk assessment, right? Now, we're going into something that could very, very easily be circular. And if this is circular, in my opinion, you cannot go any further. So even if you could prove that this is circular, then I would have to establish an axiom that says, if this is circular, I'm going to ignore it. Right? And you could say that you can use a circular argument in your further philosophy as long as you establish it as an axiom. I don't think it's necessary because I don't think it's circular. I'm staying from the inside looking at my qualia, right? I'm just deciding to treat them in a particular way, right? That's not a metaphysics. That's just staying where you are and don't pretend you are somewhere where you can't go, right? So I don't think it's circular. But, let me know what you think, right? And by the way, how about a like and a share and a subscribe, right? If you don't subscribe already, please comment and let me know what you think about this. My last slide is a recapture of what I've done so far, right? I have identified phenomena and I've categorized them in A, B, and C. Then I've decided that because B follows A and C follows B and or A, right? Then the reduction base is A, and A is what I always have to be able to go back to as a reference for my philosophy. So when I get way back down the line to a moral principle, I should be able to track all the way back through maybe a list like this, but the general philosophy also, right? All the way back to that reduction base. So I control what I'm doing. So I'm just not making up shit along the way because I need it, right? I can't just bring in whatever I want at any point. And also, from each step, I cannot bring knowledge into my external world philosophy. If I do that, I'm violating my own structure, right? So there's also an interdependent no-go, right? I can't bring in science into my ontology, for instance, because science is when you have established knowledge at the earliest, right? How could you do science without knowledge, right? Or an idea of knowledge, maybe, right? But maybe you could argue differently, maybe, but according to my standard, I couldn't do that, right? So there you have it. Phenomena, the reduction base, there's the first action, which is there is an external world. The second action is an external world influences my phenomena, right? Because I used that axiom in order to get to the point. You could say that axiom 2 and 1 should be switched, maybe. But then it's circular. I mean, it's like, and this is the problem maybe with the external world, that it's hard to deal with it without creating circles. And this might be the circular nature of what I'm doing, if it's there, right? And then I would have an axiom 2a or 3 or axiom extra that says, if this is circular, I'm going to ignore it. And okay, I have never seen anybody doing anything remotely as rigid as I'm doing here. It might still be circular, as I say, but show me a better way to do it and I'm all in, right? If you can show me something that is better and less circular, if it's circular, right? I want it desperately, right? Okay, so then I'm defining knowledge as a cognition. If there's a cognition, that cognition is knowledge, right? I'm not going to, maybe I should mention that if I think of an elephant, that's not knowledge, because it's not a cognition, as I alluded to before. It's only when I have an actual cognition that I know that. So if I'm cognizing this cup, I know this cup, right? I'm cognizing this hand, I know this hand. If I'm not cognizing hand, I'm not knowing hand, or any hand, right? But I'm aware that I can do it because I just talked about that cognition. But I'm tapping into the concept of it, the form of it. But I'm not knowing hand. No, there it is, right? Now I know it, now I don't. Now I know it, now I don't. So the point is, you can only have knowledge in the now, so to say. Your imaginations of the future cannot be knowledge. Your memory of the past, or any part of it, cannot be knowledge. Right? This puts some huge limitations on knowledge, in my opinion. But you see, what I hope comes across is, now I actually have some fucking foundation for my knowledge. And you can scrutinize it all you want. I hope it's sufficiently rigid to say, well, it's based on this. Well, yeah, but then that's based on that. And then we go back to a reduction base. And you can say, well, I don't want that reduction base. Okay, fine. Then have your own philosophy as you want, right? I'm allowing that. I'm not telling you what to do. This is my philosophy. If there's flaws in it, I would like you to point it out. And if you have some better solution, let me know. Let me know. I'm all ears, right? This is just the structure of how I think it should be done. It's not that difficult, really, is it? You just have to do it fucking rigidly. And don't allow yourself to do any dogmas or any shit that you're bringing in your backpack along from your own philosophy. When you start on your own philosophy, you basically have to forget everything. all your dogmas. You cannot bring in the Vienna Circle, for instance, right? What the fuck is the Vienna Circle? It's not a phenomena. If anything, it's an old dogma, right? You cannot bring along your old abstractions or labels to abstractions or ideas that were a result of some kind of impregnation of your abstractions from prior qualia cognitions, because they might be wrong, bad philosophy. That they might influence your philosophy in a bad or unwarranted way. Yeah, I have to bring along Kant. I have to bring along Hume. I have to bring along Plato, whatever. No, none of that. Get rid of it, right? When you start on your ontology, everything goes. All abstractions disappear. They should, because they're dependent on something that is deeper, which is the qualia and the cognitions. But how do you realize that without getting rid of them first? So you have to get rid of them, but if you don't know or realize you should get rid of them, you might not get rid of them, and then you create bad philosophy, right? This is why it's hard to do this, because you might not realize how deep you need to go in order to do it well. Okay, I hope it makes sense to you at least, right? So, as I said before, let me have your comment. Please share, like, and subscribe. And consider a donation, and there's also a Discord board below where you can join. And if the link doesn't work, let me know also, right? And beyond that, have a nice day. See you in the next video.